Go ahead and turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 4. We're going to look at that passage that was just read a few moments ago, toward the end of chapter 4 there. I guess if you were going to title my lesson, it would be described as looking out for one another. Very mindful of many people in this congregation that do that, and do it very effectively. And one who is no longer among us that did it extremely well. And I'll talk a little more toward the end maybe about Jeff. But this passage here in Acts chapter 4 that was just read a while ago, if you think about it, somehow or other it doesn't actually fit with what's going on in the earlier chapters. And I only mean it by this as far as the flow of what's happening here. When the book of Acts opens up and begins talking to us and telling us what's going on, it begins with Jesus, his last moments actually on this earth, and then his ascension into heaven. And you think, what power God is demonstrating. And then as the apostles are instructed, just toward the end of chapter 1, they go back to Jerusalem. Jesus tells them they're to wait to pray that the power will come upon them. And Acts chapter 2 starts that way, and just a demonstration of what God is able to do in miraculous ways. These guys that are standing up and speaking all these different languages that they never knew before, and that's powerful. And the miracle of the tongue speaking that comes upon them. The people that are hearing all these discourse and the preaching of the gospel about Jesus and why he came. And then at the end of that, then along about, what was it, chapter 2, verse 40 or so, that we find that 3,000 people were baptized that day. What a change and what a power that God is showing here. Well, in chapter 3, you move on and you're still seeing the effectiveness of the preaching of the gospel. And in chapter 4, even amongst that, there's some opposition among the church by some of the Jewish leaders. And yet they can't make any headway because God's power is still working. And all of this is continuing to go. And then all of a sudden, here's this little bitty section about taking care of people's needs in chapter 4 at the end. And you think, what does that minor little activity have to do with the preaching of the gospel? The demonstration of God's power, people being miraculously healed, and so many more things in the midst of all that's going on. Until you realize how important that little segment is to the life, the activity, and the encouragement of those people that are new Christians. Now, some among you have been in the church for a long time, and whether you have or haven't, you probably understand, at least in part, what it takes to make a church function. And those that have been in the leadership roles especially do. Can you imagine the work that the apostles had? By the time Acts chapter 4 unfolds, it no longer starts counting people, talking about 3,000 baptized in chapter 2, but it just says 5,000 men. And assuming they had wives, most of those men, then you've automatically come to a pair of people, or 10,000 people, and let's say throw in a couple kids for each family group, and you're looking at 20,000 plus people that they have to take care of. Where do you get 20,000 people to meet? And if they meet in separate places and in different homes, how do you logistically work that out? How do you work out just getting the Lord's Supper to 20,000 people? Just think about that. Now, couple the logistics along with the fact that all these people are brand new Christians. Brand new. And some of you maybe been with people or remember yourselves what it was like to be brand new and how little you knew and how much you wondered what was supposed to go on and what you're supposed to be doing. And here's this whole brand new church, 20,000 people, and they're not too sure what they're supposed to be doing. And now you might say, oh, but these are a lot of adult people that have come out of Judaism into Christianity and already have been identified in what God is expecting to do. Yeah? But remember also, the leadership of that Jewish people have been going on for some time. And the way that God actually looked at them, how totally off base they were in the ritualism and the meticulous little details that they cover, leaving out the most important things that Jesus discussed during his time on earth. And so that was what they were fed with. So you can imagine where their maturity level was as they came into Christianity, as far as understanding spiritual things at the very bottom. And this is what the apostles had to deal with in working with and helping them. Now, think about that and couple that with the fact that opposition is coming against the church. Peter and John have already been thrown into prison at the beginning of chapter 4 of Acts. How are you going to be able to strengthen all of these people? What kind of a job can you do as 12 apostles, even 12 for that matter, even if you can work miracles and can speak different languages? How do you do all that? Where are they going to get their strength? And that's what we look at when we see verses 32 and 37 in chapter 4. Because as it's describing this, it's talking about a guy who they nickname Barnabas. And the term means son of encouragement. Because that was such a powerfully important thing in the midst of everything that seemed to have a demonstration of power, and yet it was something that was done by the average guy. So well done, such a simplistic task, that made a difference, not only to the apostles, they gave him the nickname, but I suppose that they gave him the nickname because of what it did for everybody else included. And so as you're looking at all of this, from the leadership of the apostles all the way down to the minute, remember they're all brand new Christians, so they're all new, what a difference that made for them. And so all he did was, it says here that he took a piece of land, a piece of property, and he sold it. Verse 37, and he brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now that's a pretty simple task to perform. You always look at, or at least sometimes look at works in the church as the high task and the low task, and the easy task and the hard tasks. And yet in the midst of all of this, God gives special attention to this as if it is extremely significant and important what's going on in the church. Because of all that's happening. Because the fact is, I'm looking out. And I know for a very fact that this morning that there's a good group of people here, a variety of people, that had to struggle with just getting here this morning. For a lot of different reasons. Things happening in your heart. And there's probably a whole lot more that I don't know, obviously. But because I personally know some of you, and I know you're dealing with some issues. And out of all that's happening, you chose to get here because you knew something would benefit by your being here. And we're looking for one more ounce of reason why to keep on going. And we expect we'll find it here. And God willing, we will. But highlighted in this lesson demonstrates how important that is for every one of us to be able to and effectively do that work. That is so important that it's what makes the church continue to go on. Yes, it needs the preaching of the gospel. By all means, it has to be done. Yes, God's work has to work among the people. And in that day and time, there were miraculous things happening. Obviously, it has to be done. But you've got to also count in that package deal the importance of just making sure we look out for one another. So effective. They were dealing with persecutions, new church, insecurities, unknowns. They didn't have any idea what was happening. And how nice it was that somebody came in and said, I'm doing my part. Don't know much else to do, but I'll do my part. And so he did. Let's think about this for just a moment, because really the Bible does give us some instruction on how to effectively do our part in that. In a variety of different passages that God kind of sprinkles about throughout a lot of the New Testament letters, there's the phrase, one another. And so as we're looking at what's going on, I want you to see what's happening here. Now, we'll look at chapter 4, first of all, of Acts, and read one more time, verses 36 and 37. And then we're going to look at these one another passages. And Joseph, who was also named Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated, by the way, son of encouragement, a Levite of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. He was concerned about his fellow Christians, recognizing what was there and how it was going to be difficult as brand new Christians to hold up under persecution, under stress, leaving families, and so much more that was working against them. And he says, here's my part. I care for you. Let's watch out for one another. Now look over at Romans chapter 12 with me for just a moment. By the time Paul writes this letter, churches existed for a little while. Not a great length of time, but for a short period of time. And Paul, in writing to this church, is writing to the church, obviously, in Rome, capital city of the entire empire. Effectively, it would be compared to maybe our Washington, D.C., the center of power for the Romans, the center of wealth, of influence, of education, also the center of everything that goes wrong in a world, the center of evil, the center of immorality, the center of greed, the center of everything that goes on in politics that isn't right. That was in Rome also. And here in the midst of this prominent city comes a church. And they need encouragement. They need to be reminded to stay faithful in spite of what's going on in the world. They need to be challenged to be different. You get to chapter 12, and Paul starts with a very familiar verse, at least many of you probably read this, when he says, I beseech you, or beg you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your body a living sacrifice. Well, think about it for a moment. They already do know people who have been put in jail because of their Christianity. Very likely, even some of their own family members, possibly even some of those that hear this letter by the time they get it, are receiving it by word of being in prison. And you know, people that have lost their lives, they know what sacrifice is. And yet Paul still reminds them that this is what we are about as Christians. I want you to be a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And that world out there, be not conformed to the world, but rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's letting God guide you daily, having His influence and reading His Word and doing all you can to keep the mind going the right direction. Now, how are you going to do that? Living in a world like we live in Chattanooga, you walk down the street and you see everything happening, much like that it may have been happening in Rome, possibly more so in Rome at that time, but nonetheless, the impact is still there. How do you go about doing it? How do you keep the strength going when things don't go right in your own life and then the influence of the world keep tumbling in too? How do you keep doing this? How do you keep grabbing a hold of it? And all I can think of is what went on with Barnabas. We've got to encourage one another. And so he goes on in verse 10 as he's dealing with all these things. And he tells us, well, let's back up to verse 9 and read what's happening. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil and cling to what is good. In the midst of everything that's happening wrong, when Christians get with Christians, the most important thing we can do is care for one another. So let love be done without hypocrisy. Verse 10, be kindly affectionate. He didn't just say affectionate, because he's not talking about just this gushy-gushy, but kindly affectionate. That kindness that just oozes out of individuals toward one another. There's that one another thing. With brotherly love. Let's make sure we get it right. In honor, that's where you let the other person have first choice. You give preference to one another. You respect that person more than you. In honor, it says, giving preference to one another. You first. You go ahead. I want to honor you. I'll let you have first choice. It doesn't matter about me. And when we have a church that's responding that way, we are doing effectively what Paul's talking about in making sure we're lifting up and caring for one another. And that's something that anybody can do. It's something that everybody ought to be doing, Paul says, basically. In spite of all the miracles and all the power and all of what we say are extremely important things in the whole process, what has more impact and what effectively helps a person keep on going, to instill more faith, to give more courage, to add more of this bravo in the whole thing, to make us hang in there, is when we watch out for one another. And when we can do that, then verse 11 is a little easier. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, rejoicing in the Lord, rejoicing in hope. Well, those things only happen when verse 10 takes place and verse 9 fits in, that love is without hypocrisy. And we're making sure that we're taking care of one another. So we distribute, verse 13, to the needs of the saints. That's what Barnabas was up to, you see. We bless those, matter of fact, who persecute us, verse 14. And we don't curse them. We rejoice with those that rejoice, and we weep with those that weep. Verse 16, we try to be of the same mind toward one another. And that's not easy because we all think differently. We all have different ideas of how church work should be done, and how this thing should be done, and how all these... And Paul says, you work that out. Be of the same mind, one toward another. Don't set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. We don't always feel like that. And yet Paul says that's what we're supposed to do anyway. Kind of reminds me of what he writes in Ephesians chapter 5. He's talking about Christ and the church, and yet when the first part of it starts out, you think he's talking about husband and wife. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it. He writes in there. And then a little later on he said, well, I'm talking about the church and the way Christ gave himself up, but husbands, you do that too. I find it interesting that Paul doesn't say, husbands, love your wives when they're good to you. Because we could start dividing that up. Well, you weren't good as today, I'm not going to love you as much. It just blanket, just do it. Even when you don't feel like it. Because Christ did that even when he didn't think we deserved it either. And so when we think about who we are as a church, there are times that we don't feel like it. There are times really that some of my brothers don't deserve all of that love and kindness because they've been grouchy and cranky. You met a couple of those? Yeah, we all get that way sometimes. And yet Paul didn't say only do it when they're that way and the rest of the time just brush them off. But the fact is, during the time when we're cranky and fussing, we're having a difficult time, it's because the world has been beating up on us. And so we just respond that way when we get with our brethren, our family, don't we? And that's when we need all the more that care for one another. See, when the need is the greatest, that's when it looks like we don't deserve it as much. But that's when we have to give it there. That's going to make the difference of whether or not a church becomes a strong church. That's going to make the difference as individuals if we hang on or if we give up. But if I'm reminded that I've got a refuge here and I walk in this door and I know I'm going to meet a few people that may be off and have a rough week, but for the most part, this is the place that's going to care for me. No matter who I am, no matter how much money I have, no matter what I smell like, it's going to care. And that'll make the difference in whether I hold on or not. Because in spite of all the miracles, I've got to have some love to keep me going. I've got to have people that care that I'm here and are glad to see me. And that's what Paul's talking about here. Now there's a few other passages. I'm going to trip through a few of these just real quickly here. Romans 14, verse 19. Let us pursue the things which make for peace and the things which edify one another. Romans 15, verse 5. Now may the God of patience and comfort grant you to be like-minded toward one another. Romans 15, verse 7. Therefore receive one another, just as Christ also received us. Our 1 Corinthians, there should be no schism or division in the body, but members should have the same care for one another. Galatians 6, verse 2. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ, which is to love one another. 1 Peter 1:22, Peter says, love one another fervently with a pure heart. The fact is, in the world there are so many things that tear us down. So many things that go wrong. There are people that are against us. There are health issues that are against us. And we've got to do all we can do to make sure we can, at best, make that not as difficult and overcome those difficulties that the others are dealing with. Now, you and I, this morning, for those that are members here at Central, have a memory of a fellow named Jeff Ruhr. Jeffrey was the type of guy